I will talk about coal-fired power plants, but I will also have to talk about a kind of batteries that you probably never have heard. These are the Carnot-Batteries. My first picture shows some of the coal-fired power plants in the world. It's only a fraction because there are about 3,000 of them. And coal combustion is about 1/3 of the anthropogenic CO2 emission. So the big question is, what can we do with these 3,000 power plants in order to get rid of their CO2 emission? Apparently, it's not a good idea to demolish them altogether because it's a tremendous economic loss. And our main question in the DLR is, how can we decarbonize these 3,000 power plants and the 100 power plants in Germany without demolishing them altogether? That's the big question. Is there any way of keeping a part of the power plant and modifying another one? And this is the point where I have to explain you the basic idea of something that we call a Carnot battery. It's not a battery in the sense that you know from your mobile phone. A Carnot battery is a device for storing large quantities of electricity, gigawatt hours or even terawatt hours. It looks very simple. Please have a look at the left picture. A Carnot battery is a device that takes electricity from the grid, from the wind, from the sun, and that converts this electricity into heat, using either a heat pump or an electric heater. And then the heat can be stored. And as you know, storing heat in liquid salt, in solid state materials, or even in water is much, much cheaper than in batteries. And the third element of a Carnot battery is what the thermodynamics people call a power cycle. It's essentially a device like a steam turbine that you use in order to convert the heat back to electricity. The Carnot batteries have a lower efficiency because you have two engines, heat pump and steam engines, but they have much longer lifetime potential and they can use abundant storage material. Now the question is, how can we apply this idea to decarbonize a power plant? And here is an idea that was developed at the DLR. The problem about the coal-fired power plant is not the power plant, it's the combustion of coal. So why not keeping the steam turbine, the generator, and part of the existing infrastructure and replacing the coal burner by a big high-temperature thermal energy storage? So what you see here in pink are two big tanks. Each of them is filled with molten salt. The cold salt is 200 degrees, the hot salt is 500 degrees, and then you can use this heat, drive a steam turbine, and produce electricity. Now, where does the energy come from? It has to come from somewhere. It comes from renewable sources, wind, water, and sun. So this is the simplest case. We have also developed concepts for more advanced so-called third life storage plants, which involve high-temperature heat pumps, which do not yet exist. These heat pumps are under development in a new DLR institute in Cottbus and Zittau. And the essence of this is that the third life storage plant or heat power plant, as we would build it today, would have an efficiency of approximately 1/3 or 35%. But if we succeed in developing these new high-temperature heat pumps, which have nothing to do with the small heat pumps you know, then we could bring up the efficiency to 70%, and that would be really great. Now, my PhD advisor always told me there is nothing worse than showing tables in a presentation. But on the other hand, Professor Wiesler told me that we want to see data. And in this situation, the advice of the president of the Helmholtz Society was more important than the other advice. And I have to apologize for these figures. The black figures are for the engineers because they like the accuracy. And the red figures are for those of you who just want to understand the order of magnitude, like the physicists. We look at three different power plants. The first column is, in German, Braunkohlekraftwerk, the lignite power plant. And please look at the upper left figure. The number 1 is the amount of CO2 that you produce if you generate 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. So in an ordinary coal power plant, 1 kilogram of CO2 per kilowatt hour of electricity. Now let us convert this power plant to a gas-fired power plant. That's a technology that you can buy off the shelf. Then you reduce the CO2 emission from approximately 1 kilogram to 0.5 kilogram, which is nice, but which is not optimal. And with our concept, and this is the third column, you can reduce the CO2 emission of this power plant to nearly zero. That's already good. But as you know, nothing comes for free. If you want to do something against the climate change, you have to pay something. And this is the second line. 5 cents per kilowatt hour is approximately the price that you would have to pay for ordinary coal power. Now, if you convert from coal to gas, second life, then the cost goes from 5 to 10 cents. And if you go from gas to thermal power plants, then the price goes up. That's the bad news. But the good news is the following. If you talk about climate change, then there is one single most important figure. This is the cost of CO2 emission, CO2-Vermeidungskosten. And you have always to try to find the technology that has the lowest possible CO2 emission cost. And here you should have a look at the figures 150 and 100. Converting a power plant to gas operation may be cheaper, but the CO2 avoidance cost, as we predicted from our preliminary data, is lower if you do the transition from the coal-fired power plant to the storage power plant that I presented. So the conclusion from this table, which I hope was not so boring, is the conversion of the coal-fired power plant is expensive indeed, but the cost of avoiding CO2 emission is competitive. And when you go home, please estimate the cost of CO2 reduction for buying an electric car or for insulating your home, and you will see that these figures are way higher than the 100 euro per ton that I'm showing you. So what is the DLR currently doing in the field of Carnot-Battery and coal-fired power plants? Now, of course, we have industrial partners in the two important coal regions, and we investigate with them the specific possibilities of converting specific coal-fired power plants into storage plants. So the picture that you see on the right-hand side, I would be really happy to explain it in detail. It's a beautiful picture of a power plant process. This is the kind of pictures that you have to look at and to simulate in order to come up with a better cost estimate than I did in my table. What we also do, we have applied for a competition which is called Reallabor für die Energiewende, and this is a joint application of the DLR and RWE. So we hope to convert at least part of an existing coal power plant and to demonstrate that this technology works indeed. On the laboratory scale, we have a demonstration project at a much, much smaller scale, 10 kilowatt, which goes under the name Chester. And we also collaborate with a company. Malta is a spin-off from Google X, who wants to demonstrate another concept of a Carnot battery. And we are discussing with them the possibility of demonstrating their technology jointly here in Germany. Last but not least, I mentioned there are about 3,000 coal-fired power plants. We will not be able to analyze all of them in this detail, but what we intend to do is to analyze them at a more general level and to come up with a better estimate of the cost of CO2 reduction for the worldwide fleet of coal-fired power plants. And this brings me to the political part of my presentation. I will not talk about the German energy policy, and I will not talk about the Kohleausstieg. I will leave it to your decision whether you like it or whether you don't like it, but I would like to spend a couple of words on how transitions from one technology to the other take place in reality. And as you see, DLR people like to show old pictures. The left picture is a picture by Adolf Menzel. It shows a steel plant in the year 1900 something. And at that time, the steel plant was operated by a couple of thousand people, and the working conditions were not very good. Today, the steel plants look like that, and you need maybe 5 people for one shift. Now, the question is, how did we come from A to B? I cannot remember any commission that instituted a ban on manual work in steel plants. There were two economic mechanisms. On the one hand, the labor cost went up, and on the other hand, the cost of new technology went down, and at one point these two cost curves crossed, and then we saw a transition from one technology to the other. So the question is, what can we do in order to get rid of the coal-fired power plants? Of course, you can institute a ban on coal-fired power plants, but that will not be possible on a global scale. And so we, the scientists, have to work in order to decrease the cost of storage. This is what we do. But on the other hand, many economists come to the conclusions, and I agree, that without somehow increasing the cost of CO2, it will be very hard to see the transition from the coal-fired power plants to the storage plants of the future. And I leave it to your decision or opinion to think which way for the transition from coal to renewable energy you prefer. Last but not least, I would like to send to you the message that Helmholtz is really at the forefront of the development. Carnot-Battery research is now taking dynamics. There is a demonstration project by the company that was already mentioned, Malta, which is also backed by Bill Gates. I didn't have time yet to talk to him because my timetable is very full, but we talked to his employees and to the Malta people, and they indeed want to carry out some experiments at the molten salt facility in Cologne at the DLR. So you see that the large-scale infrastructure that we have at Helmholtz also contributes to these developments. And I would like to finish my presentation with a word of the Nobel laureate Bob Loughlin, who visited us in Stuttgart. The most important of the many alternatives to covering the globe with hydroelectric lakes, it's not a competition with hydrogen, but with hydroelectric lakes, is storing the energy in heat. And with this message, I would like to finish my presentation, and thank you very much.